Everyone in movies and books and popular media, there's a lot of like really negative possible outcomes that people are afraid of. You might have heard the term doomer, right? People that think that AI is going to kill everyone or it's going to take all of our jobs. And then every corporation is going to basically be like running as a zombie organization that has no employees, but makes billions of dollars. And while those outcomes are not likely, any movement towards some of those really negative outcomes could be problematic, could be dangerous, make life worse for some people and better for others and tip the scale towards inequality.
This is the ERP Organizational Change Journal podcast, brought to you by Nestell & Associates, a Newport Beach, California-based ERP organizational change management firm serving the private equity industry. The ERP OCJ seeks to share expertise, insight, experience, and research, and to create effective conversation to help guide ERP organizational change to real, measurable, and verified success. And now, here's your ERP expert and host, the founder of Nestell & Associates, Dr. Jack Nestell.
Hello everyone, Jack here. Today we're going to have fun discussing artificial intelligence. We'll discuss the alignment and control problem, economics of AI, heuristic imperatives, and the multiple objective optimization problem, and the global alignment taxonomy omnibus, which is an alignment of global superintelligence before it emerges with decentralized networks, an area that our guest is very familiar with. Our guest today is an AI and AI alignment researcher, transdisciplinary polymath, a YouTube communicator, and a post-nihilist. He shares on his YouTube channel that, quote, "My mission is simple, help create utopia with AI. Crystal clear elucidation is my superpower. I use transdisciplinary approach, synthesizing numerous disciplines, including philosophy, history, evolution, coding, sociology, game theory, economics, and automation. I define utopia as a world where 1, high standard of living for all humans, 2, high social mobility for all humans, and 3, high individual liberty for all humans." Interesting for sure. So let's dive in. Joining us from North Carolina, David, welcome to the show.
Hey, Jack, thanks so much for having me. And I'm looking forward to where our conversation takes us today.
Absolutely. And your YouTube channel is so fun and you have such interesting topics, David. And I really appreciate the way you approach AI. And obviously, I think as a result, I'm not the only one because your following is growing. And so I do appreciate your work. But David, before we get started, can you introduce yourself further to our listeners? And in particular, I know maybe talk a little bit about your clients and the idea in some of your other areas of interest. So, for example, polymorphic apps, cognitive architecture, and you talk a lot about this idea of crawl, walk, run, fly, and also better, faster, cheaper. And then the other phrase that you also use occasionally is just natural language interface and reasoning engine. So can you just kind of briefly, talk to that before we get into some questions I have for you?
Yeah, absolutely. So for any of your audience that is not familiar, I got my career started as many technologists do. I was in IT, infrastructure, cloud, automation for about 15 years from 2007 until earlier this year. I guess it's 16 years. And all the while, my real passion was artificial intelligence. And so I would revisit it every couple of years as the industry advanced. And then finally, in the last few years, obviously, people are familiar with the GPT technology, which has really kind of kicked off the next revolution. And so I started my YouTube channel to kind of share my work and my experiments. I started a Patreon and started taking clients, and the rest is history. But, to introduce a little bit more about kind of what I've been up to specifically, obviously on YouTube, I share videos, kind of explainers, tutorials, evaluations, and deep dives. And then for my clients, most of my clients, so I have clients of all sizes, ranging from one-person startups to 1 or 2 Fortune 500 companies. And most of what I do is actually product design around generative AI. I also do a little bit of strategic consulting. People kind of want to know where AI is going, even helping candidate selection. One of my clients, they wanted me to help them pick a CTO, kind of test their chops, so to speak. But yeah, and so because of that, a big part of what I've developed is kind of, okay, how do people onboard? Because this is, ChatGPT came out late last year. It really exploded this year. And so a lot of people are scrambling to kind of catch up and figure out where things are going. And so, the crawl, walk, run, fly model, I actually collaborated with my wife on this, who's a product owner at a data company. And so this is kind of the model that we developed to help onboard companies into the generative AI space.
Very interesting, David. Thank you for that. I appreciate it. I'm so excited and honored to have you join us today because, as I'd mentioned, I really think your YouTube channel is quite valuable and interesting. And you have a lot of experience in programming and AI in general, and your insight will definitely be valuable for our listeners. Listeners, all of us here at the ERP OCJ hope you find this podcast useful as we share lessons learned, discover best practices, and explore the human element components of ERP organizational change. Please stay with us till the end. David will give us his actionable gold nugget of advice based on today's conversation, and I will recap today's key discoveries and offer my suggestions on how to implement what we've learned. Because our conversations here are built around the listen and learn approach, but it's when you apply what you've learned that you begin to move the needle forward. So let's dive in. So, David, the first question I have for you is, speaking of your YouTube videos, in one of your popular videos, you discuss how AI can create a post-scarcity leisure class where corporations can produce more with less. So let's talk about that in the context of business systems and ERP if we can. And so my first question is, how can AI redefine ERP and other business systems, particularly in the context of increasing productivity and reducing workforce?
Yeah, to provide a little bit of context to color my answer is my career was in IT infrastructure. So I viewed ERP from kind of the substrate, underneath all the technology supporting ERP systems. So if my answers are a little off color, that's why. It's because I'm coming from a slightly different school of thought. But from a technology standpoint, most organizations are highly, highly dependent upon obviously the human element, right? The workers, but then the technology that the workers interact with, whether it's business automation, workflow automation, data, billing. There's all kinds of domains that all touch technology. And what I suspect we're going to start seeing first, because some of these technologies are being deployed, but we're at the very, very tip of the iceberg. And so one of the things that I predict we'll see first is anything that integrates with an API. And of course, a lot of ERP systems and other business software systems all have APIs. So we're going to see basic Office productivity first with Office 365 Copilot and Bing Enterprise kind of coming down the pipeline. But not long after that, from an ERP perspective, from an enterprise perspective, you're going to start to see probably semi-autonomous AI tools kind of entering into that space, which is basically just going to be an extra tool in the toolbox for existing employees. Over time, however, and this I expect will actually ramp up pretty quickly with some variance. Obviously, some things require human judgment. Some things require a licensed human to make a decision. You might need a CPA or a lawyer to make certain judgment calls. But with that being said, we're going to see a lot more kind of piecemeal automation, and that's going to get scraped together over time to get to like fully autonomous automation. It's difficult to have a timeline on any of these things, but a lot of the underlying technical capacity is there, especially with some of the latest generative AI models. One of them, several of them, Gorilla is the name of it, is trained to access 10,000 different APIs right out of the box. So already you have a tremendous amount of capability, but it takes time to integrate, it takes time to test, and it takes time to make sure that you do these things correctly and you don't harm the business, right? It's all about the bottom line. That's kind of my initial thoughts as to where generative AI is going to take the ERP trajectory.
Fascinating, David. I love your response. And so, speaking of harming the business, do you have any thoughts on this question? What changes do you foresee in financial systems and policies and regulations due to AI, and how might this impact ERP structures or business systems in general?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the prevailing wisdom right now, and you see this in regulation talks, particularly in the European Union. There's some talk about this in the United States as well. But the idea is that human in the loop. That's kind of the drumbeat that they're beating, which is basically that no matter how autonomous any of these AI systems become, that there should be a person making a decision. And of course, in any kind of business automation tool or platform, you usually have checkpoints, right? Where it's like, okay, you need a human approval. So in that respect, I think that there's not going to be not a whole heck of a lot of difference, moving forward. However, what I think we're going to find is that some of those bottlenecks, you're basically going to end up with people that their primary role is just kind of rubber stamping decisions or suggestions that the machine is making. And then you get decision fatigue. And so decision fatigue, organizational psychologists will be familiar with this, but basically anytime an employee has to make a decision, it kind of costs a little bit of, their mental steam for the day. And if you're making repetitive decisions, eventually you just kind of get lazier and lazier. And that's not an indictment of people, but like your brain just gets tired and you kind of start choosing shorthand. And so, in terms of how regulations are going to play out, financial regulations are going to play out, but then also harming the business, I think we're quickly going to discover that machines are going to be much more reliable at making some kinds of decisions. And this is some of the work and experiments that I've done where, sure, if any of your audience is familiar and you plug in, Chat GPT and you ask it for an answer and it'll kind of, barf out an answer that may or may not be any good. There are things that you can do with these to check itself, to check its own work, or have a system of checks to make sure that the work that it thinks that it's doing is good. And so what I suspect the first big bottleneck is going to be is going to be that, okay, well, if the machine is, it's like running on a treadmill, right? The treadmill is going to keep going whether or not the human's on it. And so these autonomous and semi-autonomous generative AI tools that are going to be throughout the organization, they're going to be able to keep running whether or not the human is even awake, at the wheel. Trains have kind of a dead man button where like every 5 minutes you have to push a button to make sure that the train operator is still awake.
Yeah.
Right. And I think that we're gonna see a few problems there because, and we've already seen this with Zillow, for instance, where they used AI to put in bids for a lot of property, and they ended up buying way too much property and driving up the price of real estate in some of the markets that they were operating in. Why? Because there was no human oversight. And so that I don't know how it's going to play out, but that is where I see kind of the first big hurdle in terms of, okay, how do we implement these technologies in order to, of course, increase productivity without unintended consequences like, driving up your prices or making otherwise just any kind of bad decisions automatically.
Well, good insight, David. I'd like to ask you now then some questions about global collaboration in AI development. And you have another video about the importance of global collaboration and dialogue in AI development. So I'd like to draw parallels to that discussion. And I think, David, that the YouTube video was the AGI Moloch, equilibrium, attractor states, and heuristic imperatives, how to achieve utopia. But my first question in regards to that video was, how can such collaboration shape AI's evolution in business systems and business in general, or in terms of the ERP context?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And, to provide a little bit of context for that video, the work that I was doing, everyone in movies and books and popular media, there's a lot of like really negative possible outcomes that people are afraid of. You might have heard the term doomer, right? Mm-hmm. People that think that AI is going to kill everyone or it's going to take all of our jobs. And then every corporation is going to basically be like running as a zombie organization that has no employees, but makes billions of dollars. And while those outcomes are not likely, any movement towards some of those really negative outcomes could be problematic, could be dangerous, make life worse for some people and better for others, and tip the scale towards inequality. And so that's the framing context to answer your question in terms of open source collaboration or transparent research. And so there's actually, these were not my ideas, by the way. These are just ideas that have been kicked around within the AI alignment and research spaces. And so there's two international organizations that were kind of the inspiration for some of these ideas. One was CERN, CERN is based in France, and they run the gigantic particle accelerators. And that international research, it pulls together like 10,000 physicists on an annual basis. They have a budget of, I think, like $6 billion. And they publish all of their research to the participating nations because the value of that research is just so high that it's not worth keeping private. And then the second organization is similar. It's ITER, which is trying to build fusion reactors. And of course, the joke in the industry is fusion is always 20 years away. But the idea is that fusion would be so economically valuable to everyone that, again, it's not worth keeping it private. And so AI is kind of the third pillar that is very similar, where the possible benefit to all businesses, all nations, the entire human race is so high that this is the kind of thing that it would be worth creating an open source or international research consortium. And so there's talk about doing it. A lot of us put all of our work out there for free, open source. And so that is just part of the way that the industry is going. And when you have a new technology like this, that it's kind of like the Wild West. Nobody knows left from right. And so we're all kind of scrambling to move as quickly as we can. At the beginning, I played with the idea of keeping some of my work private, but then it's just like, okay, the rest of the industry moves on. And, one of the mantras that I came up with that I kind of repeat is that aligned AI is good for business. Aligned AI is good for more than just business. It's good for everyone. And so that's kind of the underlying ethos that kind of drives some of these decisions, where obviously every corporation has some protected IP. They're going to have some proprietary software and innovations. But by and large, the amount of possibility here is just so great. It's like a blue ocean fishing expedition. You just go out, you cast your line, you get your fish, and there's enough room for everyone to get their fish. So that's kind of the background of that mentality.
And David, when you talk about aligned AI is good for business, what role could regulatory frameworks play in promoting ethical AI use in corporate landscapes? And don't we all benefit if it is we're all aligned? It's not just that AI is aligned for business. AI alignment in general is good for business, right? So what do you have to say about regulatory frameworks and how it promotes ethical AI use? And this is actually something you talk about as well in this particular video that we referred to earlier.
Yeah, absolutely. And so here's the thing is some of these, whether it's a regulatory framework or an industry-based framework, basically we're at a point where nobody really knows how to get started. And so this is actually some of the feedback that I've gotten from some of my clients is actually that the work that I've done, some of the frameworks that I have built or relayed that either come from universities or governments or commissions, basically it's just a roadmap. That's the way to think about it, is that, okay, yes, regulations are there to say like, well, you have to, be this high to ride this ride, or you have to do things in a certain way, otherwise you'll get fines or whatever. But really, because this industry is moving so fast, everyone needs all the help that they can get. And so by having a clear framework, whether it's a regulatory framework or a roadmap or whatever, if you think about it as it's there to help you in order to adopt these things safely, because here's an example from a conversation that I had with one of my clients, is that he went before his board of directors, and his board of directors, they were all like in a panic because we got to do generative AI, but we don't know what we don't know, and we don't know how to get started. And so he carried some of the work that I had done, and it just had all the answers ready to go. And they're like, by the end of the meeting, they had the confidence that they knew how to approach generative AI safely, because it's about de-risking it, right? If you implement a new technology and it goes sideways, you could be on the hook for, damages or losses or whatever. And so the idea is you got to move fast, but if you're too reckless, you're going to do unintended harm. And so that's why a lot of these regulatory frameworks or guidelines or roadmaps are coming out, is because everyone is lost and everyone's doing, everyone's trying to catch up as fast as they can. So really, that's my primary recommendation, is just look at it as a roadmap. This is how you do it right. If you follow the instructions, you won't burn the mac and cheese.
So, David, let's chat more about the alignment and control problem. How might the heuristic imperatives guide the pursuit of these positive outcomes in AI development application within businesses? And maybe to ask the same question in a slightly different way, I think your solution to all of this is what you call heuristic imperatives. So can you please elaborate for our listeners what that means, and then how it's a potential solution to the alignment control problem?
Yeah, absolutely. So for some background, when I first got my hands on these technologies, I realized we had invented thinking machines. And that was a really profound realization to sit with. And I said, well, if you've got a machine that can think about anything, how does it know what to think about? How does it know what to do? And so the first couple of years of work that I did on this generation of GPT technology, it did take about 2 years to figure it out. Was okay, what are the general principles that an autonomous or semi-autonomous AI should abide by in order to just not go wrong? And the end result of that 2 years of work was what I call heuristic imperatives. And so a heuristic is a shorthand. It's a rule of thumb. It's a way of making decisions or judgments very quickly. And then an imperative is a command or a mandate. And so what I ultimately came up with was a framework of 3 heuristic imperatives that serve as kind of the highest like moral compass or a set of principles or guiding principles for any autonomous AI system. And that is reduce suffering in the universe, increase prosperity in the universe, and increase understanding in the universe. And so when I published all this work and I started giving examples and demos, of course, some of my clients started integrating these into their chatbots. And the feedback that I got was, whether it was a chatbot or one of them was an autonomous research assistant, was that by incorporating these principles into the design of these generative AI tools, it gave them a broader context, a more global context or scope of thought that kind of kept them on like, okay, whatever else is true, this is my purpose. This is why I exist. This is why I was built. And, all corporations, whether they're providing goods or services, they are there to increase prosperity. That is why corporations exist, is because they're efficiency-seeking systems to provide necessary goods and services that ultimately, if you drill down, pretty much every business on the planet ultimately either reduces the suffering of someone or increases their prosperity or teaches them something, right? Like that's why medical care exists. This is why therapy exists. This is why cars exist, right? Everything exists. And so these universal principles that I came up with are really, one, they're easy to implement, and that's one of their strengths. But then it also just gives a more nuanced understanding as to like why the AI tool exists. And by incorporating that, rather than, because here's the thing, let me take a step back, is when people start designing AI tools, they often think very tactically. And by tactically, I mean like, follow this step, follow this step, follow this step. It's like the peanut butter sandwich, right? You give someone really explicit instructions on to make a peanut butter sandwich without ever describing what the end goal actually is.
Yeah.
And so by providing some of that context, some of that like strategic context, it tends to make pretty much everything that the AI does a little bit better. And that has actually evolved to what I now call mission-oriented programming, that was described in one of my most recent videos.
Fascinating topic, David. Thank you for that.
Yeah.
And now I'd like to ask you a question really regarding AI people and organizational change. So let me pick your brain here for a minute.
Sure.
And so relating to your video about Ray Kurzweil, and we'll put this link in our show notes for our listeners. The Ray Kurzweil had a prediction of biological immortality and its implications. So let's bring it back to AI's potential role in organizational change for a moment. So you state in this video that, quote, compounding returns and that it is nearly impossible to accurately predict how new technologies will recombine specifically. AI, nanotech, genetics, quantum computing, and other scientific breakthroughs will almost certainly combine in unexpected ways and therefore have rather profound effect or impact on people and certainly in our field, Nestell and Associates field of work, organizational change. You then alluded to the iPhone as an example. So when you think of the impact from more of a social perspective, how could advancements in AI catalyze organizational change in merger and acquisition environments, for example? Any thoughts? Put you on the spot with a question like that, but what would you say about that?
Yeah. Well, first, to address the technological and scientific aspect, certainly there's going to be new products and services that are coming, entirely new categories, right? This is where the tech industry is right now, is they're obsessed with creating new categories of goods and services and products, all built around generative AI. Now, with that being said, there's plenty of brick and mortar businesses out there. Some of my clients, they do parts or they do hospitality, right? Where, they might not be subject to AI because, say, for instance, you travel to Singapore, even if, you maximize the amount of AI and robotics, you still need a hotel, right? You still need a pool.
Right.
You still need, there's some things that aren't going to change. At the same time, some industries, some sectors, there's a lot that can change. There's a few things that I kind of predict may happen to some sectors. That is, in some cases, I predict that the margins are going to become so narrow, the industries are not going to be able to survive as they are today. And so what I mean by that is in the cases of organizations or sectors that are primarily providing services that can be done electronically, the amount of reduction of cost that generative AI is capable of producing, you're not looking at, shaving off 5% or 10%. You're looking at cost reduction of 10x to 1,000x of some services. And in those cases, the margins just get too narrow, and the products or services are going to get absorbed by other organizations or other entities. In those cases, those might be targets for acquisitions as the margins collapse. Some services might also be moved and provided at the municipal level. So, for instance, I wouldn't be surprised if healthcare, as some of these technologies recombine and drive down the cost of healthcare, it might not be viable for them to be for-profit services anymore. So it's going to vary a lot sector to sector. And of course, there's probably going to be some new sectors. I was just listening to some podcasts from the industrial side and the way that people are expecting things to go with industrial robotics, humanoid robotics, kind of displacing factory workers. That's going to create an entirely new demand for people building, maintaining, and programming humanoid robots. At the same time, what happens to those human workers? And there's a lot of questions that are kind of still up in the air. And as I did mention in that video, it is very difficult to predict exactly what's going to happen. So it's kind of keep your ear to the ground and keep your eyes open to see what's coming down the pipeline.
It's the wild frontier. It's absolutely amazing to me and exciting, I guess, to see where this goes for that very reason. David, we talked about this idea of frameworks, but what strategies should businesses adapt to in order to manage changes that come with AI implementation? Can you share with our listeners anything specific along the strategic lines on how to manage through these changes that you just referred to when it comes to AI implementation within an organization?
Yeah, so this is where we can kind of dive into the crawl, walk, run, fly model. So the crawl, walk, run, fly model comes typically more from within the technology stack. So anytime you're implementing or experimenting with a new technology or discipline, it's kind of this mentality of, when you first get started with something, you're not going to know what you're doing. You're going to fall down a lot, just like toddlers learning to walk, right? You fall down, you bump your head. It hurts, you learn, and you move on. And so this crawl, walk, run, fly model is the first thing that companies need to do. And this is companies, this is individuals in the company, is first overcome the fear and demystify this technology, because like any big, gigantic, sudden change, it is overwhelming. It is scary. There's unknown unknowns. And so the crawl phase of this model is just get your hands dirty, right? Go play with it. Create environments for yourself and your employees that there's no risk of failure. So here's an example from when I was participating in a startup. Is I was, years and years ahead of some of the younger guys, and I was teaching them how to get their feet wet with the generative AI techniques and implementation strategies. And one of the younger guys, he just completely froze up because he's like, well, but I don't know how to do this, and Dave knows infinitely more than I do, and I told him, I was like, I know you're going to mess up, I know you're going to fail. The point is to learn, not to produce on day one. There's all kinds of ways that companies can address this. You can do hackathons, you can do competitions, you can just do it for fun, right? Like do something that is completely unrelated to your business. Like who can come up with the funniest story, right? With Chat GPT, something like that, just so that you get used to these new technologies and you start to build an intuition. So that's the crawl phase. The walk phase is when you start to actually do some prototyping. You create a POC or an MVP or a pilot program, and you don't necessarily have to build these things internally either. There's more software as a service and off-the-shelf white box products and services available today. But the idea is you do have to actively experiment. And that means with experimentation, you will still fail. You will say like, well, we thought we were going to use, Bing Enterprise or Perplexity or whatever. And we didn't get the value from it. Okay, cool. If it doesn't work, let it go, try something else. But the idea is, I got this from Franklin Roosevelt, actually, is by God, just try something, right?
Yeah.
Just keep trying something
Right.
until it works.
Yeah.
And so that's the walk phase. And then once you get the first thing that really works, that really adds value, and when you know that it's really adding value when people suddenly can't live without it, right? It's like, well, you gave me this new toy and you said that we're not going to pay for it anymore, but it's really going to hurt my workflow.
Yeah.
That's how you know that it's really kind of stuck the landing, or you at least found a niche. And then the run phase is where you start to operationalize that. You say, okay, cool. We found the first thing that works. Let's find the second thing that works. Let's deploy it as broadly as we can across the entire organization and really aim for saturation. And that's going to be a more kind of conventional approach from an ERP perspective. And then finally, the fly phase. And this is kind of optional depending on the particular sector or business. But this is where you create a center of excellence around generative AI. In creating a center of excellence will absolutely be necessary for some organizations because it's going to change their entire industry. Like I said, for some like hotel chains, probably isn't going to change that much. But if you're a law firm or an insurance company, you probably absolutely will need a center of excellence because of just how fundamentally AI is going to change your business. So that's the crawl, walk, run, fly model at a kind of 30,000 foot view.
Well, interesting. David, what we do know is that corporate culture is crucial to ERP organizational change success. Could the emergence of new tech domains and markets due to AI influence corporate culture and employee engagement? So for example, you mentioned earlier this idea of humanoid robots, or maybe not quite that extreme, maybe even just, the current deployment of Chat GPT. Do you have any comments or thoughts on how just AI in general can or is or will impact this idea of corporate culture, which is the interaction of people, right?
Yeah.
What's your thoughts there? I mean, that's a big corporate culture is a big part of what we do. And it's a huge part of the success of what we call very deliberately. We don't call it ERP implementation. We call it ERP organizational change because it definitely takes that triad, right? The people, process, and technology. And I know that can seem a bit cliche-ish, but it's true. And, corporate culture and leadership is a huge part of successful implementation of that technology and utilization and optimization of that technology. Any general comments as far as due to the AI influence, what could corporate culture look like or how could it be changed?
Yeah, so there's a few conversations that I'm aware of that are happening, particular to culture. So many entrepreneurs that are kind of hard charging, blazing the trails for others. One of the things that they say is that they have no intention of laying off any employees if they can avoid it, because this is of course where you're going to get a lot of fear in the company culture. And certainly having worked at several companies going through major transitions, some people will react with fear and kind of clam up or kind of throw up their walls and defenses. And that just makes work less pleasant for everyone. But what some of these entrepreneurs and business leaders are saying is they have every intention of keeping every employee, but the expectation is that they will invest time in learning and mastering these new technologies. And so from a culture perspective, the thing that I hope to see is, the concept of BS jobs going away, right? Like if you have to have today, there are jobs that humans have to do just because machines can't do them, but they might be boring, they might be unfulfilling, they might be kind of mundane. But the thing is humans are smart. Like we're the smartest animal on the planet. And so nobody really deeply enjoys kind of a menial job. Some people like, the low stakes and the low pressure. That's fine. But we are intrinsically curious and creative animals. And what I hope will happen is that people will see that AI, even though it probably will dislocate some jobs, it will get us away from kind of the drudgery and allow us to move more towards really using our creativity. and our executive function and our problem solving. Now, that's kind of pie in the sky. That's the hope and dream, right? If I were still working a corporate job, I would be using all the AI tools that I could to automate as much as I could of my job. And I would find that fascinating and fun. And like, hey, can I automate an entire department? I can be the man behind the curtains, pay no attention to me. I'm just running all the autonomous gizmos. Now, on a more practical level, I think that generative AI is going to help with things like training. And communication probably first, because generative AI tools like ChatGPT, they can read huge volumes of information, but then they can also train you, or maybe not even train you, but like just kind of be a co-pilot in terms of writing emails and writing Slack messages and planning meetings. And so by having this kind of cognitive co-pilot, this is the term from Psychology Today, actually, an article that came out last week. By having and deploying these cognitive co-pilots, it can really increase the emotional intelligence and communication skills for everyone. And that alone will probably have a pretty profound impact on corporate culture in the long run. But again, you have to get people using these tools. So, I mean, there's a million different little ways that generative AI could either directly or indirectly influence corporate culture.
Yeah, absolutely. And David, you've talked about the idea of post-labor economics in your videos. And I'm intrigued to discuss its relevance to ERP organizational change, if we may. So how could the shift to post-labor economics affect businesses in their ERP or business systems? And actually, David, you may want to start out by defining post-labor economics for our listeners, if you would. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah. So, right now, the way that economics work is there's a relationship between workers, laborers, businesses, and the government. Those are kind of the three primary actors. You might also say that banks or financial institutions are kind of the fourth actor, but from a labor perspective, it's not necessarily directly relevant. But we're already seeing some of this happening out in the industry, where call centers are kind of the first departments that are not necessarily being shuttered, but we're seeing, 90% of the department being laid off in some cases. And then on the industrial front, the other podcast I was listening to, the goal is to have basically every factory be a lights out factory. And so, if you can replace many or most of your frontline workers, then, that's going to really change a lot. That's going to really fundamentally change the labor market landscape. And as it is today, so I and others have done some experiments. I think it was Goldman Sachs or whatever published a similar thing where they basically concluded that 25% of jobs today are already vulnerable to AI, and it could be 70%, as soon as 2030. Mm-hmm. And so there will probably always be some kinds of labor that are just ideal for humans to do. And we don't have to get into the specifics unless you want to. But when most of the economic productivity comes from machines, and those machines are owned by corporations, that really kind of cuts out the human labor aspect. Mm-hmm. And so that's going to really kind of fundamentally change the relationship that corporations have to human labor. It's going to change the relationship that consumers and voters have to businesses. And that is the overall context of what I mean by post-labor economics, is the greatest constraint placed on corporations today. The biggest bottleneck is human labor, right? It's one of the most expensive aspects of business. And so on the one hand, what I expect to see is that with the rise of AI and machines, we're going to see this just unprecedented amount of economic productivity, where the price of goods and services just is cratered. It goes way, way down, because that's what technology typically does over time, is that it lowers the cost of goods and services. At the same time, it's going to liberate a lot of us from the desk jobs and whatever else. But there's a lot to renegotiate in terms of the relationship that we have between what is the government's role, what is the voters and the laborers' role, and what is the business's role in doing all this. Because and something that a lot of people point out, it's like, well, if all the laborers lose their jobs and they have no income, then they can't buy anything from the companies anyways. So then we're back to square one. And so I don't know how it's going to shake out, but this is the trend that I see. And in terms of what it does for organizations on an individual level, obviously, if you reduce your employee headcount by 90% in the long run, there's a whole lot that's going to change in terms of who's left. how do you pay them? And how does your relationship change to your consumers, to the government? And so there's a lot to unpack there.
Speaking of how do you pay them, David, that's exactly, there is a lot there, and it's such a fascinating topic. So I want to kind of drill down a little bit further and ask you two more,
Sure.
maybe not so common questions in that regards. But, as you'd mentioned, if AI can fundamentally change the relationship between human labor and business, how might redistributive policies such as universal basic income impact businesses and ERP and business systems? So again, kind of a general question, but there's a lot of talk about that, right? And the idea of universal basic income, and that's where AI is going to take us. And so, any just general thoughts on how that could fundamentally change and impact businesses and their use of business systems or ERP?
Yeah. So I want to frame this answer as I don't necessarily think this is the way that it's going to go, but this is a common idea that's out there.
Yeah.
And so it very well may be the way that it's going to go, but I'm not personally endorsing this policy. But one thing that people think is likely to happen is that corporations are going to be taxed in proportion to the amount of productivity that they generate from machines, whether it's AI or robots or whatever. And so the idea is that you're basically going to be, it's almost like an inverse like VAT tax, where it's like, okay, rather than being taxed at the transaction, you're going to be taxed based on how much of your revenue comes from non-human labor. Now, how that shapes the organization, I'm not really sure, but the idea is that, okay, yes, go be a $1 trillion company, go be a quadrillion dollar company, but you're going to pay in proportion to how much revenue you generate through these other means. And then that revenue could be used for any number of things. Universal basic income is one possibility. People are afraid of inflationary pressures from something like redistributive policies. But one thing that a lot of people forget is that job loss is deflationary. So we might actually need inflationary pressure from redistribution in order to offset the deflation if we end up losing millions and millions of jobs. So remember, all this is contingent upon the assumption that jobs are going away permanently, which could be wrong. I don't see any evidence that it's wrong yet, one way or the other. But if that's the direction that it does go, and you end up with companies that have relatively few employees, but millions or billions in revenue, they're going to need to participate in the broader ecosystem in a slightly different kind of paradigm than what we have today.
Yeah, sure. Well, David, I'm sure my next question here is it's a pretty unique question, I suppose.
Sure.
But in the context of post-labor economics, as you discuss with our listeners, how can new measures of well-being, like the well-being index or Maslow's hierarchy of needs, be integrated into future ERP systems?
That's actually a really interesting question. I didn't expect something like that. So this is actually something that I've been working on personally. I'm technically semi-retired now. I take 2 weeks off every month, except for making YouTube videos sometimes, but I'm taking all of August off. And well-being is this really weird thing where we are so used to working hard every day. And learning to slow down and learning to reclaim some autonomy and learning to basically slow down and smell the roses, right? There's so much inertia that's built up in a productive or production-oriented society like ours. And so in terms of how do you measure it, right? One of the best, frameworks, I'm a big fan of frameworks, is Roger Walsh's therapeutic lifestyle changes, TLC. So he created this framework of 8 lifestyle changes that you can do that gear you towards well-being. And I'm not going to be able to remember all of them off the top of my head, but it's time with friends and loved ones, rest and relaxation, time spent on hobbies, time spent in nature, spirituality or religion, those sorts of things. So that it's this inventory of 8 areas in your life that you can invest in. And the more well-rounded you are in those 8 areas, generally the happier you are or the higher your well-being. Now that's more of a therapeutic framework rather than a metric, but I could easily see that being converted into a survey, like, how much time do you spend with
Yeah,
friends
right.
per week, or how much time do you
Hmm.
spend in nature per week? So if those metrics turn out to be useful and probative, I think that it would actually be pretty easy to measure people's well-being as we renegotiate a new social contract, our relationship to labor and companies.
Yeah, again, fascinating stuff here, David. Clearly you have thought in quite deeply about many of these topics, and I really appreciate that. You had a video, one of your YouTube videos here just a couple of weeks ago, and I want to draw on that video, and that was Elon Musk focus on AI and its alignment with human goals. And again, we'll put this link in the show notes. But I have a couple of questions regarding strategic implications of AI in business. So, how can businesses, especially those involved in M&A, incorporate AI into their strategic planning, keeping the objective function of maximizing understanding in mind? So, I
Mm.
know you've kind of alluded to that. We touched on it earlier in the conversation a little bit, but can you dig into that a little bit further?
Yeah. So for some context, Elon Musk started X.ai, and the objective function that he has picked for his AI is to achieve maximum understanding of the universe. So this is an AI that is pure curiosity, unbridled curiosity for the sake of just move towards the truth, whatever the truth happens to be. Which from a intellectual perspective, I think that's a wonderful objective function. I don't think it's necessarily the best objective function for an AI, particularly if it's going to become super intelligent, but it's a good
Yeah.
start. Now, how that intersects with looking forward strategically for M&A activities. One thing to keep in mind is, as I mentioned earlier, in some cases, I think margins are going to really thin out. So if I had a checkbook with $1 billion, I would not be buying any companies where most of the labor is actuarial or that sort of thing. Like even law work, I think is the margins are just going to completely collapse.
Mm.
And I have some lawyer friends that are actually worried about that. But fortunately,
Yeah.
you need to be licensed to practice law. The lawyers will be around for a while, even if the law-oriented products and services maybe thin out.
Yeah.
Now, in terms of objective functions and the direction that AI is going, it's almost like you have to look in terms of first principles, right? Because there's so much inertia in the marketplace today of things that exist because of trends that are decades old. And so one of the things that I look for, and again, this is just completely amateur advice, is what is actually needed by consumers, right? Like and I don't mean like, durable consumer goods necessarily, but that's not a bad place to start. Like we all need a place to live, we need food, we need healthcare. And so by kind of taking a first principles approach to looking at the way that industries and sectors are going to be impacted, I feel like that's probably a good way to say like, okay, well, whatever else changes, people are going to need basic goods and services. And then, some goods and services might go away or they might fundamentally change. So for instance, we briefly touched on longevity earlier. I wouldn't be surprised if 20, 50 years from now, hospitals go out of business because we
Mm.
don't need them anymore. Right.
Mm.
And that's a really like, pie in the sky,
It's a crazy
possibly
thought, isn't it?
yeah, wishful thinking. Right.
It's
But it's not outside the realm of possibilities. And the reason is, within weeks of making that video, there's been several articles published about combinations, new cocktails of exotic, plant medicines that actually biologically reduce the age of your cells. And it's been, validated, and there's mouse models proving this. And it just seems like we're accelerating. And so, just as an example, imagine that this trend, just take it out to the nth degree. Okay. Everyone is as healthy as they were when they were 18 years old. Like that would be great. Let me tell you, I've got some joints that will be really happy with me if we can do that. But if
Yeah.
everyone is as healthy as they were when they were 18, that completely changes the healthcare industry. And then all of the subsidiary industries that are entailed by the healthcare industry. So that's kind of the direction that things might be going. So, I might not be investing in hospitals, but, you invest in the AI that can make the new medicines. There's a meme going around that says, when everyone's digging for gold, sell shovels. And so that's why the NVIDIA stock price has tripled in the last 6 months, because they're selling the shovels. So I don't know if that helps answer your question, but that's kind of word on the street right now.
Yeah, no, that's good. Thank you, David. I appreciate that. What strategies can businesses employ to ensure that their AI initiatives align with human curiosity and the goal of understanding? You look just at Chat GPT, for instance, and you've got students now writing papers in 5 minutes,
Yep.
and I know there's a lot going on there in terms of being able to determine what's written by AI and what's not. But any thoughts on just strategies that our listeners can consider and employ to ensure that this idea of human curiosity and the goal of understanding continues to be a major part of corporate culture despite these incredible advances in AI?
Yeah. Well, I guess I'll answer in two parts. The first part will be from an evolutionary perspective of humans, and the second part will be from more of an organizational perspective. I'm imagining you've probably read The Fifth Discipline, and many of you listeners probably have as well.
Yeah.
But from an evolutionary perspective, humans, we doubled down on intelligence, right? The smarter you are, the better off you are, because you can solve more problems and you can solve them faster. This is particularly true in the tech industry, and this is kind of what I built my career on, is that you got a star player who can solve a technology problem literally 100 times faster than someone who isn't. And I can't tell you the number of times that I was, roped into an IT problem that they had been fiddling with for hours, sometimes days, and I figured it out in 20 minutes. And so intelligence is almost always advantageous. And, you might say, well, intelligence on its own is not the same as wisdom or understanding. When I say intelligence, I mean all of the above, the judicious application of problem solving to achieve good outcomes. So from an evolutionary perspective, more understanding is always better. The more you understand the business, the technology, the market, the more you understand people, the better you're going to do. And, this is proven out by all the greatest leaders throughout all of history. They were all prodigious readers. And if they weren't prodigious readers, they talked to everyone that they could and learned directly from people. So understanding is always advantageous. And then from an organizational perspective, to me, the most valuable thing that I learned from reading The Fifth Discipline was the concept of the learning organization. And it's a different paradigm when, rather than thinking of people as cogs, you think of people as active participants in raising the tribal knowledge of the entire organization. And I think that AI has the ability to turn that up to 11. And so, I guess the TLDR that I'd give you and your listeners is focus on being that learning organization. Focus on using the superpower that humans have, which is our intelligence. And of course, no two people are created equal in terms of cognitive abilities, whether it's emotional intelligence or visuospatial intelligence or whatever. I think there's 8,000 different types of intelligence that have been categorized by some psychologists. Everyone has different strengths and weaknesses. And really what I would say focusing on in terms of developing that culture and developing curiosity is allow people to really flourish and focus on whatever their key strengths are and figure out a way to allow them to contribute back to the tribal knowledge of the whole organization. And that's where you'll see some really, really good magic happening, I think.
Fascinating insight, David, as usual. I love it. All right, David, you mentioned in your video, DeepMind, OpenAI, Microsoft, Oxford, global AI research and regulation is coming, that you are deeply optimistic about the future of AI. So my question to you is why? But I also know that you are not saying that AI is a salvation fantasy or the false promise of utopia and so forth. So I know that you've actually discussed this idea in 2 different videos, I think it was, but why do you feel optimistic at the same time saying that AI isn't a salvation fantasy? So I think you believe in more of an AI balance, and correct me if I'm wrong, but why?
Yeah, great question. And thanks for asking that one. Yeah, so first, the reason that I'm optimistic is because there are no problems that have been posited or proposed or discovered or theorized that are not solvable. And this is part of just how science works is you publish a paper, you read a paper, there's a problem and it seems unsolvable. But I haven't seen any evidence that any of the problems before us, are beyond our capability to solve. And that includes some of the risks, right? Whether it's a regulatory risk or an existential risk or whatever. I don't see any reason that the problems that have been outlined, discovered, and even some of the unknown unknowns that crop up. As a career problem solver, I don't see anything that is intrinsically unsolvable. So that's why I'm so optimistic. Now, at the same time, the idea of what's called a salvation fantasy or a utopian narrative is the idea that the ends justify the means. That some people might have their personal vision of the future of how it should be or how it could be or how it ought to be. And what can happen, and this is just a cognitive bias that people have. I've been subject to it, and I'm sure every business leader has been subject to it, where you envision an outcome that you want, and you forget to pay attention to right now. And that's the primary thing. And there's a business philosophy out there called long-termism. Elon Musk is a long-termist. And this is one of the primary criticisms I have. Not that it's intrinsically a bad idea, but if you spend too much time with your head in the future, it's called future surfing, then you forget about the present. And so this is why I always urge caution about utopian narratives and salvation fantasies, because yes, the future almost certainly will be better if we do things right. But that means that everything that you do today, one step at a time, also has to be the right thing to do. There's a turn of phrase that I learned. It's called just do the next right thing. Whatever your long-term goal is, whatever problems you're facing, whatever you're afraid of, just keep your feet where you're at right now today and just do the next right thing. And eventually, one step after another, you'll get to a better place. And so that's why I urge caution against utopian narratives or kind of putting the cart before the horse, right? There's, I got a whole bag of idioms I can pull out for this one, but that I think you get the idea.
Well, that's great, David. So David, as we wrap up this incredibly insightful conversation, I'd like to ask you for your golden nugget. So given all that we've discussed today, could you briefly summarize the key takeaways our listeners should remember? And based on these insights, what is the single most valuable piece of advice you would offer and leave with our listeners as they navigate their own journeys in organizational, just in AI in general?
Yeah, I mean, I think to both of those, it's probably the same thing, and it's just roll up your sleeves and get your hands dirty. It's time. I know that some people are going to be probably lagging indicators or late adopters, but there's not really anything to be afraid of, and there's just so much to gain, and you're not going to lose anything by doing some experiments and poke the new technology, get the shiny new toy and just see what you can do with it. Best case scenario, it changes your company and it changes the trajectory of your entire life and your entire career. Worst case scenario, you can't use it yet. So either way, like you learn something but yeah, just roll up your sleeves, get your hands dirty, try it, see where you go, and talk to people about it because we're all in this together. And it's one thing I tell people is this is the most exciting time to be alive in the history of all of humanity. We are living through the fourth industrial revolution. And so it's just a privilege to be part of it and to be seeing it in real time. And I'm sure we'll all look back and be like, wow, can you believe we used to do all this stuff manually? We'll get to that future one day.
Well, David, thank you so much for your time today. I really do appreciate your time and your dedication to your trade and to AI and your approach to AI, your academic-based approach to AI and sharing with people. And I highly encourage people to check out your YouTube channel. And we'll have the link to your YouTube channel in our show notes. Before we go, can you tell our listeners how they can get in touch with you?
Yeah, so there's two simple ways to get in touch with me. One is LinkedIn. Just if you send a connection request, just make sure you add a note as to how you heard about me or kind of what you'd expect to get out of the relationship. And then the second is I am available for consulting, as I mentioned. I do most of my one-off consulting through my Patreon. You can have the link in the show notes as well. But I am also available for longer-term engagements, short-term contracts, speaking engagements, that sort of thing, teaching engagements. So yeah, just reach out on Patreon or LinkedIn. That's the best way to get a hold of me.
Awesome. Well, thank you again, David. Be well, and we'll talk soon.
Thank you so much. Take care.
You bet. Thank you.
Thank you for joining us for today's episode of the ERP OCJ podcast. This podcast is intended as a forum to study, share, and discuss ERP organizational change successes and challenges.